Welcome to class, students. My name is Mr. James. I hope you are well today and ready to learn. In today's class, we are looking at foundation concepts of scientific communication. Specifically, we'll be looking at a science classification system called taxonomy. Before we move on into the content of the lesson today, we honour Francis Carroll values. As you know, Francis Carroll created Carroll College. So the values of Francis Carroll that we honour today are the values to give and to receive. There will always be a reward in return when you give to something. So on we go with our learning, and let's hope good behaviour in class. In today's lesson, we will be looking at what is taxonomy. Why do we use taxonomy in science? How does it make sense to us and other scientists? And how did the system of taxonomy come about? Who invented that? Who came up with the idea of taxonomy? And towards the end of the lesson, we'll be looking at the benefits of using taxonomy, not only for other scientists, but for people in general. Classification is a method of organising life forms on Earth into categories that are based on their appearance and the natural relationships between them. So we know of all the life forms on Earth that include plants, animals, microorganisms, and other forms of life. We call them species. So remember the word species and get used to understanding what that means. A species is a human being, but we're a type of human being. So there may be several species of human beings, if we can imagine that. Also, try and imagine birds. Birds, there are many different species of birds. So, for you to imagine that, just think that all the different types of birds that look different to you may be related in some way. So, we call this scientific classification. It's science's way of identifying and grouping living things in an organized way so we can understand them. And we can also refer to their names when we talk about them, write about them, or use them in scientific inquiry. The classification of organisms is a science called taxonomy. More specifically, it's a form of systematics. You may not know what that means, but if you want to look it up, you can look up the word systematics. Species are given a two-part name, the genus and the species. Before we move on to watch the class video that is about the history of science classification, specifically where the concept came from a person called a famous Greek philosopher, mind you, called Aristotle. I wanted to show you an example of a family of birds. We can see here that all of these birds look different in some way. Some have longer beaks, some have shorter beaks, some have slightly different wing shapes and colours. So what that tells us is these birds are slightly different to each other, but they all come from the same family and they are all the same species of bird. How do we name them then? Well, to name them correctly, we've got to acknowledge the differences they have. So we'll find out later in the class how that is done in terms of the species name. So what we know now is the concept of the common name of these birds. So you may know that type of bird, that's a pied oyster catcher. That's a common name. but we'll learn later in this, towards the end of the lesson, how we scientifically name these birds. So the video we're watching today is about a person called Aristotle. You can remember him as being a famous Greek philosopher. You may not know what philosophy is. That's another word that you can look up and talk with your parents about. A philosopher comes up with grand ideas that are meaningful to many different things. And Aristotle formed the idea of the nature of classification into families. So, what he said was the concept of the family is the association established by nature for the supply of man's everyday wants. Well, that sounds a bit confusing, and he needs a bit more to explain what does that mean. So Aristotle had further sayings. And what he said was a specific group of people that may be made up of partners, children's parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. So this is the concept of a greater family. He went on to say more. He said a group of people who share common ancestors. So people must have known who their ancestors were. They lived in villages that were full of people from their ancestors, and they all shared common family names and symbols. A group of people who are related to each other, such as a mother, a father, and their children. So these might just seem very basic concepts to you, but in the ancient times, people were looking to explain where they came from and how did their families come about. So the Greek philosopher called Aristotle came up with the very basis of the form of classification called taxonomy that we know today. We'll play the video now about Aristotle, and it's important that you remember his name and what he did to contribute to scientific classification.
Aristotle was the first person to classify organisms. He believed there were only two groups of organisms, plants and animals. Aristotle also classified these two groups into subgroups based on specific characteristics. The subgroups of plants were based on size, and the subgroups of animals were based on location or habitat. Our next individual is Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus is considered the father of taxonomy, or the science of organism classification. Linnaeus created a hierarchy of different classes. For us humans, our kingdom would be animals, our phylum would be chordate, our class would be mammals, our order would be primate, our family would be hominids, our genus would be homos, and our species is sapiens. Linnaeus's classification system is the one that we use today. The only difference between now and then is we have made several discoveries that led to more groups and classes of organisms. Linnaeus also invented binomial nomenclature. The reason binomial nomenclature says we're called this is because our genus and species. Binomial nomenclature takes these two classification levels and puts them in organisms' scientific names. Since Linnaeus's inventions, classification has evolved. Because of the invention of the microscope, we discovered bacteria, archaebacteria, and protists. We even created a new classification level called a domain, which is now the least specific level. Organism classification is really important and helps biologists keep themselves organized. Without Aristotle, Linnaeus, or the microscope, we wouldn't be where we are today in the field of biology.
Okay, class. So we have learned that the need to organize living things is very important and extremely useful when we're studying those things. Classifying things also saves time and effort. The classification system represents genuine relationships between living organisms. And the system is hierarchical. You may not have heard of that term before, hierarchical, meaning that the different categories, such as you have seen in the video, are grouped according to size in a series of larger categories. So we have some homework questions for you, and they're quite easy. So in our next lesson, you'll be able to share those questions with me, and we'll do it as a class exercise. Who first thought about classifying living things? So there were two main people, famous people. Name those two people and remember them. Name the 6 kingdoms of life in science. So that's something that we didn't go over in this lesson, but that is something that you'll find quite easily, and you'll be able to relate to that because those 6 kingdoms are at the top of the classification tree. And we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson and you learnt something. We'll see you next time.